See, I Am in Pieces by Tanvir Bush. I began to lose my sight in my late teens. At first it was just nibbles, tiny nibbles, taken from the edges of fingers and faces, the odd treetop lopped off the horizon. What disintegrated faster was my ability to control light. Sunlight became painful, and low light became viscous and thick, like dark, sticky spiderweb. Colour leached away slowly too, until greens and blues merged, browns and blacks, greys and purples. I have retinitis pigmentosa, or RP. The cells in my retina, the rods and cones, forget their function, wither and die, knocking one another down like dominoes. We don't know why. And now, 30 years later, I see only in small fragments, using a tiny tunnel of greasy vision to scan for clues. The useless pigment cells lie flung about like used coffee grains across the back of my retinas. I see in fragments, yes, but it's still the same world we're all living in. The same old ground that the quizzical archaeologists carefully picked at with their small shovels before the world wars, the same planet once inhabited by the craftsman and woman who made the original figures. My world and the statuettes are now in pieces, our lives a guessing game of memory and match. If I see your eye on the left, I will assume you have another eye on the right, a nose and a mouth. If I see you raise your arm while shouting, "Catch!" I will assume there is a missile flying through the air, although I might not see your entire arm throwing or the ball flying. An arm, a head, a partial torso. How do the pieces fit back together? The scatterings of that Gnossos cyst, opened by Arthur Evans at the very beginning of the 20th century, must have resembled my retinas at first. Fragments and shards of pottery, bones, shells, seeds, and clots of burnt earth, each piece casting its odd-shaped shadow in the flickering torch beams. The history of that place, the truth of that place, could never be reconstructed, not fully. As my brain does with the gaps in my vision, the archaeologists guessed. They guessed with the fragments that constituted their versions of history and culture, and we are still guessing. And when we guess wrong? Sometimes my brain fills in the gaps with the oddest things. I once saw 2 polar bears in a supermarket aisle. It wasn't even the freezer section. In that moment, those 2 bears truly existed, yet I wasn't frightened. In a way, I was waiting for my brain to catch up. Occasionally I see cats which on a second squinted focused stare have evaporated. Very occasionally and slightly chillingly are the faces pressed up against car windows that are actually only reflections and bounced light. These guesses are relatively common amongst those with degenerative sight conditions or certain brain conditions, and this magical mayhem of hallucination is known as Charles Bonnet syndrome, or CBS. Charles Bonnet, an 18th century Swiss naturalist and philosopher, was the first to explore this phenomenon. He was partially deaf, and in later years lost much of his eyesight. Perhaps because of this, he took a different view on the world around him. According to current research, mostly from within the Western population of people with macular degeneration, CBS hallucinations can be simple, unformed flashes of light, colours, or shapes. However, many people see more elaborate forms, such as geometrical grids and lattices or landscapes. I see polar bears in supermarkets. I asked an ophthalmologist about CBS once, and he said that the hallucinations were intriguing, especially the particularly vivid ones involving people dressed in old-fashioned clothing. He had several patients who saw children decked out in the ruffles, bonnets, and sailor suits of Victorian England. When I asked if these Victorian apparitions were experienced mostly by his English patients, and what about those from other countries and other cultures, He couldn't answer. What if the hallucinations were not just glitches, not just the brain desperately trying to translate the fragmented world it's experiencing? What if the polar bears and the Victorian children were glimpses of the multiverse, or perhaps signals from the spirit world? Eddies in the space-time continuum, to quote the novelist Bryan Adams, who described sofas and whales popping out of the ether in his marvellous Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series. Sure, I'm being flippant, but I do sometimes wonder if the clues are in those gaps, the spaces between the end of the outbreath and the intake of oxygen, the fleeting sensation of hope, of faith, the pause before the wave breaks, the seconds between the lightning and the thunder. Although, clues to what exactly? If the snake goddess and her votary are in part hallucinations of a blinkered white male British archaeologist and his peers, then perhaps it is possible that it is in the gaps, the in-between, the unseen, that our real goddess resides.